When 21-year-old Samuel Matx was found by police with a knife in his bag, he knew he was in trouble. He was told to expect time in prison. But his first offence, magistrates instead gave him a 3-month community sentence. A critical part of it, a tag to monitor an overnight curfew.
They said it would be done 2 or 3 days. Expect someone to come around 2 or 3 days within the curfew hours. No one came.
For weeks, Samuel says he waited for the tagging company to arrive, initially being told they went to the wrong address. He says he told the court he'd moved. Determined not to get in trouble again, he says he kept to the curfew himself while trying to contact Serco and probation to make sure they had his new details.
I'd been on hold for 3-4 hours and I thought, what can I do? I keep telling my probation worker, no, they're not come. I speak to him once a week. He asked me, have they come? I say no.
What did he make of it?
He was just huff. He was just a same old, not news to him.
So, Samuel, you are finally tagged.
I am.
So it went on a few days ago.
Yeah.
And is due to come off.
In 9 days' time. What kind of repercussion is that? It's a joke. It's laughable. I can't imagine how that's going to deter anyone. It gives me a lack of confidence in the justice system. I really don't feel like I've been held accountable for what I've done.
Samuel was put on probation on the 14th of March. We understand that no specific instructions for the tag were sent from probation to Serco until April the 1st. Serco told us after that it did attempt to fit the tag 3 times, going above the requirements of its contract. But Samuel wasn't at the address Serco had been given. Serco said he was in breach of his conditions and this was reported to probation. Probation say from Serco's visit on April the 11th until May 6th, Samuel was deemed to have withdrawn his consent to be tagged because he'd been at the wrong address. They say he was told at a meeting on April 15th to return to his original address, which he confirmed he had done the following week. Samuel then remained untagged until May 23rd. The vast majority of the time, he was supposed to be monitored.
As far as we're concerned, we tell an offender that the tag will be fitted in the next 2 days, and the expectation is it's fitted in the next 2 days.
Mark Beattie is the national chair of the Magistrates Association. He says Samuel's story is alarming.
I think we're very concerned about what we're hearing. If we're now being told that it's not being fitted for weeks, then you have to question whether tagging is an effective solution.
You know, you talk about the need for protection for victims. What's your fear here?
If they don't trust that to protect them, then that's a disaster, because the whole point of putting the tag on was to ensure that the alleged victim was safe.
But the tags being fitted in time is not the only problem, according to one insider. We've spoken to a whistleblower currently working at the heart of that very system, for Serco, the private company in charge of tagging offenders. To protect his anonymity, he's portrayed here by an actor. We'll call him Aaron. Aaron says he's so alarmed at what he calls repeated and systemic failures at Serco, he's decided to speak out.
A major part of the criminal justice system just isn't fit for purpose at the moment. It's major risk. Major. You know, you've no idea. People might be walking around with a tag on, but it doesn't mean that we're actively monitoring them.
Serco staff fit the tags, but must also make sure offenders aren't breaching any conditions imposed on them to allow them to stay out of jail. But Aaron says too often that's not happening, because he claims the monitoring system isn't working properly.
Trying to find genuine breaches, it was like a needle in a haystack, because it was throwing out all these alerts that sometimes didn't mean anything. But there'd be thousands and thousands of them that we didn't know how to identify the genuine breaches from all this traffic of data that was coming into the system.
Once Serco staff do identify any breach, they then have to pass on key information to police and probation so they can act on it. But Aaron claims, too often, that isn't happening properly either.
We've had somebody who they want to arrest for rape or potential assault, a serious assault of a victim. While they're on the phone, you look up the records to identify the person that they're asking about. And there's been instances where we haven't been able to give them that information because something's gone wrong with it and it's been installed, or something's happened in the system where the person has got a tag on, but we're not actively monitoring them. So we're not able to give them locations. And there's been instances where it's been weeks and weeks of where we think we're monitoring someone, but they're not actively being monitored.
One troubling example preys on his mind.
There was talk in the monitoring centre of a particular case where one of the authorities, I think it was the police, had got in touch to say that there was an investigation into a victim who had died, and they needed GPS locations on her ex-partner who had offences of domestic violence. I mean, it did seem to point that he was potentially a suspect, but from what I heard, we weren't monitoring him effectively due to an error. So, that is worrying.
We shared the whistleblower's claims with the head of the Magistrates Association. He says they too have huge concerns about the impact on domestic abuse victims. If tagging isn't offering them the protection it should, the risks are high.
We know that that has a direct impact on their willingness to come to trial and give their statement. We also know that actually in that interim period, it's essential for them to have some breathing space away from the alleged perpetrator. If I was a victim of domestic abuse, I would be extremely scared, having been told that tagging is the solution to my safety, and then to find it's not.
The Ministry of Justice told us they didn't recognise the claim about false alerts or that offenders were not being monitored when the system says they are. It's understood Serco rejects these claims too and is confident the system is robust and effective. Failings in the tagging service were exposed in April by Channel 4's Dispatches programme.
Serco sends us to a prolific offender near Newcastle. He preyed on old people, breaking into their homes to steal from them. He's been given an alcohol tag, though it took Serco 23 days to fit it.
In response, Serco said it was tagging a record number of people and its performance would continue to improve at pace. It prompted MPs to raise their concerns directly with the Prisons Minister. In a letter, the Justice Committee wrote, "Financial penalties have been levied on Serco every month since they took on the electronic monitoring contract last year, due to poor performance. The consistent application of these penalties raises serious concerns about the efficacy of the current contract and the level of service being delivered." Aaron, still inside Serco's monitoring operation, says improvements have been made, but serious problems remain.
It needs a massive overhaul. But what's it going to take for that to happen? Does it need for someone to lose a life? Or for that to be in the public eye for something to happen?
Growing concerns about whether the tagging system is actually working properly come at exactly the point the government is set to massively expand its use. To relieve pressure on prisons at boiling point, there will be much more community sentencing, and that means tens of thousands more offenders on tag.
I think we need to understand the scale of the problem. If they can't deliver now what we have been ordering through the courts, then we have to understand what the recovery plan is, so at the point that it ramps up, we have to have confidence that they're going to be ready to deliver it.
And without that,
how are we going to be able to use tagging as a means of control or punishment?
so what's the alternative?
Well, the alternative is that there'll be more people remanded.
But that is exactly counter to the direction the government needs this to go in.
Absolutely.
Serco told us,
"We are proud of the challenging work our people do in delivering an essential and critical public safety service, often with complex and ever-increasing requirements. Our performance continues to improve, which the MOJ recognise, and we continue to monitor record numbers of people in the community, supporting our colleagues in probation and the Home Office."
And in a statement, the Ministry of Justice said,
"While we cannot comment on individual cases, we dispute many of the claims being made. Tagging is an important and effective way to monitor and punish offenders, and any delays are totally unacceptable. While the backlog of outstanding visits has been significantly reduced, Serco's overall performance remains below acceptable levels."
We wanted to speak to the government about this, but they declined an interview. They told us they will continue to hold Serco to account and won't hesitate to impose further fines. There's a huge amount riding on the tagging programme working properly. Relieving the pressure on prisons is one thing. keeping the public protected another. Well, the Labour MP Andy Slaughter is the chair of the Justice Select Committee, and he joins me now from Westminster. Andy Slaughter, you've got an offender in there who should have been tagged for 3 months, was actually tagged for a matter of weeks. A Serco insider claiming breaches are not being properly flagged, offenders not being properly monitored. You have failings being pointed out from all sides here.
Yeah, there are big problems with this contract. And that's a worry in any case. And there's been problems with Serco contracts going back decades, not just years. But it's obviously of greater concern because the movement in the light of the David Gauke's recent review is towards more control of people out of prisons, and that means more tagging. So the system's going to have to improve dramatically in order to make that work.
I mean, exactly on that point, you wrote to the Prisons Minister, Lord Timpson, back in April, after revelations on dispatches about what you called alarming failings. He wrote in reply, "We believe electronic monitoring is a vital tool and that the government remain confident in our ability to expand." Do you share that confidence right now?
I share the confidence that it's the right way to go, and that's for two reasons. One is that the terrible crisis in our prisons, where they were down to 0.1% of capacity, 90 places left in prisons, and numbers of prisoners are going to keep increasing. So we have to find alternatives. That's the first thing. And secondly,
but that is why the tagging has to work, isn't it?
Well, that's exactly right. And if you can control people outside prison and you can rehabilitate them more easily outside prison, that's a bit of a no-brainer. But you're absolutely right. For all that to work, tagging has to work. And the technology is there. I don't think there's any doubt the technology is there. It's how the systems are working, and in particular, how this particular contract with Serco, which was awarded to them in 2024 by the previous government, despite the fact they paid a £68 million fine to avoid criminal prosecution when they last had a tagging contract in 2013. So there must be some doubt about whether this is the best provider they can find, because there are such multiple errors that came out in the dispatches programme, which you've heard more about today.
But you know, the government insists that it has these financial penalties that it can impose on Serco, that it's keeping a very close eye on them. But there is a question, briefly, if you would, about how you can win a contract where you are poorly performing from the off. They've been fined every month since they started work on this contract.
Well, exactly. That's what came out, as you said earlier, of our correspondence with the Minister. I think the Prisons Minister is doing a really good job because he's tackling probably the worst prisons crisis that, in living memory. But if you've got a contract which has failed from month one and is still failing well over a year later, you have to think this. Even financial penalties are not sufficient, clearly.
Really, sorry to cut across you really briefly. The problem is that victims need reassurance now. We heard the National Chair of the Magistrates Association say, if I were a victim of domestic abuse, I'd be extremely scared that this isn't working. Very briefly, what needs to happen right now?
Well, we need certainty. Victims, and indeed everybody, needs to know that once you come out of prison on a tag, we know where you are and your behaviour is being regulated. And that has to be the criteria for Serco or anybody operating these contracts, not what's happening at the moment.
Andy Slaughter, thank you very much for talking to us this evening. Thank you.